when you arrive at an agroecological farm, the first thing you notice is diversity. You see different crops growing together, not only crops, but tree species, animals as a part of the system, a different color of flower, different form. You are going to see a lot of life around.
Hello everyone, my name is Evelyn Zuniga and you are listening to Agroecology Bites, the podcast where we take big ideas about food and farming and break them down into small and easy to digest conversations. This podcast is brought to you by the Agroecology Partnership project funded by the European Commission. Alright, before we begin, let's make an exercise. Let's take a second to think of your last meal. What did you eat? Do you even remember? When was the last time you stopped to think about the food on your plate and where is it actually coming from? That piece of bread you had for breakfast, the chicken you had for lunch, or the tomatoes in the salad you had at dinner? Today, we're starting with a simple but surprisingly tricky question that has everything to do with the food that you have on your plate. And that question is, what is agroecology? You might have heard the word before, but what does it actually mean in practical terms? And why are so many people talking about it? To help us unpack this, I'm joined by Johanna Jacobi and Naimid Esnarriaga to share their experiences as experts in this field. Johanna, thank you so much for being today with us. It would be great if you could introduce yourself and tell our audience a little bit about your work.
I'm a professor at the Institute of Agricultural Science, that's in Switzerland, and there I work in agroecology. And I do research mainly on questions of how to democratize our food systems, on how to making them more sustainable and more just, so that agroecology for farmers actually becomes possible. So that's one part, and another part is on agroforestry, and there specifically on syntropic agroforestry, which I'm sure we will talk about later.
We are also joined by Naimid. Naimid, thank you so much for being with us today, and tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do.
Currently, I'm working as a scientist at Terra Madre, where I'm part of the data science team. And my work mainly focuses on scaling agroforestry systems, promoting agroecological practices that mainly focus on increasing carbon sequestration and biodiversity. Because the goal of the company is just to promote farmers' transition to a more sustainable cropping system and generate carbon credits so that farms can receive fair financial recognition during their agroecological transition.
Thank you so much, Naimid, and thank you both. It's great to have you here with me. Okay, before we jump into the subject, let's start with what I call a getting to know you question. And let's start with Johanna. Johanna, what first sparked your interest in food and farming?
I would say that started very early with discussions at home, at the kitchen table, for example, on deforestation and on animal suffering for meat production or on climate change also. And then when I was 16, I went with a youth exchange to India, learning about smallholder farming and GMO cotton and land struggles and also the farmer suicides, sadly. And that was really a wake-up moment for me, where there I learned about these global interactions and how they influence farming and farmers. And then conceptually, I was really influenced by this 2009 big international agricultural report that was titled Agriculture as a Crossroads, and that really showed where humanity is going with this industrial agriculture, and that we have actually quite a little time to change how we treat soils and biodiversity and the climate and eventually also ourselves through agriculture and our food systems, and that also alternatives are really existing and they actually work very well. So this was for me, these were maybe 3 moments that I can remember.
All right, that's very interesting. Naimid, was your path into food and farming similar or did it start somewhere else?
Yes, actually, also I started very early because I grew up on my grandparents' farm in a very, very arid region of Argentina, in Catamarca, where water is always scarce, the ecosystem is really very fragile, and farming has never been easy. So their farming wasn't just a job, actually. It was truly a way of life, a way of survive. And in Argentina, luckily, the northern part has the highest concentrations of family farmers. And usually they respect, family farmers are more respectful with nature, and really they try to support the well-being of their communities. So you can still find those farms with a very rich diversity of crops, animals, and they still use a lot of ancestral techniques. And fortunately, not all of those farmers were influenced by, in that time, the 60s, 17, there were some development programs that at that time they were promoting more conventional agriculture models based on heavy input use. But maybe because of the region that is not so easy to access, those programs were not so successful.
That's a great story. Thank you, Naimid. So now we all know you a little bit better. Okay, let's start with the basics. What is agroecology in your own words, Johanna?
So I use agroecology as a concept, as the application of ecological principles in agriculture. Then it has different dimensions. So in science, it brings together like all the new forms of knowledge, and it also acknowledges a lot of things that have been ignored or actively destroyed since the Green Revolution, that have been there since forever. So this concerns agrobiodiversity, women's and indigenous knowledge, or local food traditions, or governance of the commons. So there's a lot of things that are related to agroecology besides the ecological issues. There are also social and economic core topics that we also look at when we use agroecology as science. But then agroecology is also a globalized social movement with groups in most countries all over the world that struggle for the right to food and for the right to seeds and water and the right of local communities, women and indigenous groups. So it goes really way beyond agricultural technologies.
Naimid, maybe to complement a little bit what Johanna just explained to us, if someone listening imagines a farm, what would an agroecological farm look like compared to a conventional one?
I think when you arrive at an agroecological farm, the first thing you notice is diversity. You see different crops growing together, not only crops, but tree species, animals as a part of the system, different color of flower, different form. You are going to see a lot of life around. The landscapes look very heterogeneous. You won't see only one crop on the field. So, because usually an agroecological farm, they have several products as the important products, as the main products, not only one.
Some people think that agroecology is only about organic farming. What do you think about this? Is it true at all? Let's go first with Johanna.
Maybe let me start with saying I would not say only organic, because there are very different understandings of what organic farming is, even though it's so much normed. But I think there's also the difference and the commonalities. For example, not using pesticides is quite common to both approaches, or synthetic fertilizers. But it's very important to say that agroecology is not a norm that's like, say, imposed sort of by certifiers, as is often the case, not always, but often in organic. But it's based instead on principles that are like constantly co-created and refined by the people who apply them, who use them. So that goes, I would say, much further than organic, even though in organic there are also some approaches in participatory guarantee systems, for example, participatory certification that go into this direction. It's very nice that there are some approaching between the two. But if we just understand organic as a set of techniques, then it's more responding to norms. And that's not what agroecology does. It really also involves, well, first, it has these principles. They have also been compiled by the United Nations in the last years, but it also involves these social justice topics and a systemic approach, thinking about the whole food system and not just the farm, and about landscapes and so on. So it's really a societal approach. I would like to quote one of the current leading voices in agroecology in Africa, who's Terra Madre. And she says that agroecology fails when we treat it only as a technique, but it holds when we design it as a system. And I think that quite nicely illustrates one of the key differences.
All right, yeah, then it's a whole system then. And Naimid, is there something that you would like to add?
I completely agree with Joanna. Both organic farming and agroecology I'm going to say that aim to enhance natural biological processes. Both the techniques they use are quite similar. But agroecology, for me, really goes far beyond that because we are rethinking the entire farming system, like Johanna said. And I wanted to give just an example that in Argentina, for example, we are currently facing very high inflation and food prices increase every year. So one agroecological farmer is called Rafael, whom I visit when I come back to my country always. He keeps his prices almost the same price. I mean, and then once I asked him, why you keep it at the same price, but you don't increase that price, and he told me, people are going through a very difficult time. So if we support each other, I think we'll improve faster. So anyway, like he told me, I'm not going to become a rich farmer, and that's not my goal. So I think that for me really captures the spirit of agroecology because it touches the core of our human values and solidarity, care, and also responsibility for themselves and others.
Oh, right. Yeah, that's very interesting. The social aspect is also like very embedded in the concept. So what we are hearing is that agroecology goes well beyond organic labels. It's not just about what inputs you use, but how the whole farming system works ecologically, socially, and economically. So yeah, that's very relevant. All right. According to my notes, you both have spent time working in very different farming contexts around the world, including South America, Asia, and Africa. Were there any agroecological practices that you encountered there that really stood out to you? And do you think that Europe could learn from? Maybe Naimid, you could tell us first your experience.
One remarkable example comes from the Puna region in the Andes, because one of the most extreme environment conditions for cropping in Argentina. We have a very high altitude desert, very low rainfall, intense solar radiation, winds, huge temperature fluctuations. And there, people developed different and incredibly farming systems. So they combined, for example, small terrace fields, stone walls to protect crops from wind and frost. And they are mostly highly efficient with the water harvesting techniques. So I think also you will see farmers that grow native and highly resilient crops, very adapted to the local conditions, like quinoa, potatoes of different colors, sizes, forms, maize, and they also integrate them with camelid livestock, like llamas, alpacas. So I think Europe could learn a lot from these kind of landscapes. Because especially I think in the context of extreme weather conditions.
Joanna, would you have any additional examples?
Yes, I mean, as you are saying, what can Europe also learn? There's one practice that actually stands out every time I see it in different parts of the world, which is syntropic agroforestry. And that's really a way of designing agroecosystems according to natural vegetation, designing like food forests, productive forests, even for international markets with coffee or cocoa, whatever is sold from that, even timber. And they function really like taking into account the natural succession of the species and the density and diversity and some other principles. So I won't explain all the principles here, but we did a literature review last year looking at what is available regarding published knowledge on this and what Europe can learn from it for diversifying its intensive agricultural landscapes. And that paper is called Syntropic Farming Systems for Reconciling Productivity and Ecosystem Functions and Restoration. Because that's really, in my view, a way how we can do restoration of nature restoration, which is a big topic currently in Europe, together with production of food and other things that we need. So that really stands out for me. But in my work, I've been involved in many research projects and action research projects, and there I have seen so many great examples that I know that we can always find something almost everywhere. And that's amazing, right? And this is also something that we can learn in Europe. Because, well, actually it happens in Europe a lot too already, but it's not so much seen, that agroecology is often done against all the odds. It means to organize and to link like the local problems with the productive problems. It means to repoliticize and to educate consumers. And when I think about great examples that we have where I live, I see such examples, but they're quite small here in Europe sometimes. For example, where I live, there's a wonderful agroforestry CSA, community-supported agriculture, where you become a member and you support them throughout the year and not just when you want to buy something. So they produce vegetables, but also fruits and so stuff from trees. But the thing I see is that people, consumers in that sense, although I don't like the concept, but people who consume, they don't necessarily understand the importance of these alternatives yet. So they don't support it enough to be transformative. And this is where we have to learn and to work at, especially in Europe, that we can't like go on shopping food from nowhere, that we can't not just buy in the supermarket and hope that this is somehow sustainable or fair. And it's exactly these local structures that make our food system more resilient. And there's a lot to learn from all over the world, especially for Europe, I would say, or the whole global north.
Is definitely very important, and it's interesting to have the perspective from different parts of the world. You get to learn a lot of how they do things everywhere else. Now, let's talk about our farmers. We often talk about agroecology as a concept or a goal to reach, but for farmers, it is not abstract at all. For them, it means changing how they work every day, how they plant, how they manage soil, how they deal with risks. So I'd like to talk more about what this transition really means on the ground for them. So, Johanna, when we say agroecological transition, what does it actually mean for a farmer?
Well, in my experience, usually farmers know very well what they want to transform. And they also know very well and how it works, and also the limits and the obstacles, which is actually where it gets interesting for us scientists too. Because yeah, sure, we have all these nice transition models for agroecology or for organic, like from first we reduce the external inputs and then we make the farm as circular as possible, then we redesign the agroecosystem. I don't know, maybe we introduce some hedgerows, or we optimize the crop rotations. We start to use different machines and so on. There are many plans and designs for that. But our role as scientists is then a bit different, because we need to collaborate and identify ways of overcome those obstacles that are there and that farmers start to tell us when we come and say, hey, can't we do some transition here? Then often they say, yeah, I would like to, but you see, I'm in debt. My farm is actually owned by a bank, or if I plant a tree, it's not my tree, or I'm not allowed to do that, or whatever, or the market doesn't allow it. So we as scientists also really have to address these things together with them then. So it's then really about access to resources. That includes financial resources, but also like enabling rules and laws and markets. So you see, while there's a lot that can be done on the farm, this is often not possible, and it's also usually not enough. And that means that farmers also need to organize and collaborate, and consumers need to organize and collaborate too. So it can only work when we build new allies and more direct relationships to also really make political demands. So that's actually possible to change something on the farm, because where the decision is taken, what's being done on the farm is very often not the farm, and very often also not the farmer. So this is where the collaborations are so important, and where it also gets very political.
Naimid, still talking about farmers, in your experience, what is usually the first change they need to make when starting this transition? And what could be the biggest challenges for farmers that farmers face during the first years of transition from a conventional to an agroecological system?
I also think the same. Mostly of the challenges that farmers faced at the beginning are social, or not social, but technical aspects. Like, for example, one farmer in Argentina, or in also in Switzerland, that they are renting the farm. For example, they are not going to plant some trees, for example, because they know that trees takes a lot of time to grow up and also to get the benefits from them. And also they don't know what is going to happen with the land. So they need to resolve that, But from my experience, the very first and most important change when a farmer or a person that own a farm wants to transition to agroecology is a shift in mindset. So why I'm saying this? Because like conventional farmers, move from a logic of control, like controlling the pest, controlling the weeds, controlling the fertility, but mainly through external inputs. And then they want to go toward a logic of understanding and working with ecological processes that are completely different. So this means starting to observe more, experimenting more, and trusting in natural interactions. So in the soil biology, in the biodiversity, in this ecological regulation. So in practice, this often begins with simple steps, like we were talking before, like the techniques, and the diversifying crops, introducing cover crops, crop rotation, thinking in introducing different species, and also stratifications. So, and then the biggest challenge, maybe during the first years, could be an economic risk, technical uncertainty, and also emotional stress, because and why? Because farmers need to adapt to these agroecological techniques that sometimes they can represent a very high cost depending on the country. If you are in Switzerland, it's going to be very expensive to maybe to start with, because you need to you cannot use always machinery to do some specific job there. And also there is a learning curve, because agroecology requires always a new knowledge, but not a new knowledge, because usually the knowledge from agroecological techniques comes from various ancestral times, but to readapt this knowledge to the local scale, and requires also a lot of observation skills and a lot of patience.
Very interesting, very well explained, you both. We can say that these transitions can take time, they could be really challenging, but they can also be very transformative and definitely not impossible, but they need a lot of support from different actors in this agroecological context. So we've been talking about how agroecological transitions affect our farmers. Now, let's bring this back to everyday life and everyday people. Johanna, from a consumer perspective, what can ordinary people do to support agroecology? Are there everyday choices that we can make that it can make a difference, buying seasonal food or any other practices?
Maybe let me start by saying that the concept of consumer is already a bit coming from this idea that we can only influence what happens in our food system with our wallet, which I think is dangerous. So I try to use different concepts, but of course, when we start with what we buy, it's super important. I mean, yeah, of course, it goes a lot beyond buying, but buying is also important. Like, of course, organic and fair food, which we should in a way do anyway, because why would anyone would have to like to have toxic chemicals or slave labor in what they buy? But it's also about avoiding food waste, for example, or eat seasonal food, how how to cook seasonal food, what to do with these things that you have in this certain season where you live. Or then also buy without packaging wherever possible, because food packaging is one of the major sources of plastic waste, right? And then also engaging in sustainable food systems, like becoming a member of a community supported agriculture, which gives the producers security, and it lowers also the risks that they usually shoulder alone. So when they have a network of people who consume their food and distribute their food, then they are not the only ones to be at risk from climate events, for example, from drought or whatever. So that means a bit becoming what's sometimes called a prosumer. So you're not just consuming, you're also taking part in that, in production, for example. And that can actually be a lot of fun. It can be learning, it can be social activities and so on. So it's so much more than buying food. But then there are also ways of reforming the supermarket power concentration in the food system. So there are community supermarkets where you become a member and jointly decide what they sell. There are some examples already that work quite well. And then this does, of course, help with food security, but it also really circumvents these power structures or these agri-food empires in our food system that hold most of the power and decide from seeds over pesticides to what we are presented and what is accessible as food for most people. So this is what needs to change, right? And there are so many ways to be part of this change beyond just what we choose to buy maybe in the supermarket.
Yeah, that's basically the power of the people, I'd say. Naimid, so if we make this very practical, what could someone listening today do this week, for example?
I love this question actually because I'm convinced that agroecology is also really about small but conscious choices. Like Johanna said, maybe going to a small market, a local market, not trying to deconcentrate the places where we go for and search for food. Um, but this week, I would like to invite you to reconnect with food. I think everything starts from that. So I'm gonna suggest just to try to cook a meal for just for yourself, or if you buy a meal, take a moment to really sit with it, and before you eat, take a pause. Smell the food, notice its color, its temperature, its texture. Take a breath and feel grateful for having that meal in front of you, and then starting eating slowly and mindfully, thinking about how this food will nourish your body, nourish your body, how it will give you energy and become part of you. So, because I'm convinced that these small moments of awareness can really rewire how we relate to food and help us to build, a more healthier, a more respectful mindset around eating. Because if we think like the food we are going to eat, like Joanna said before, we don't want to have agrochemicals inside. We want to have a very healthy food inside us because it's going to be part of ourselves. And so that's a small invitation just to be more mindful.
That's fantastic. Thank you. Thank you, Naimid. So agroecology doesn't stop at the farm gate. Our everyday food choices also play a very important role. And that leads nicely to our next topic. Up to now, we've talked about the promise and the potential of agroecology. But let's be honest, the reality is that there are still changes to work through before this transition can really happen, especially on farms. Joanna, what do you think are the biggest challenges that prevent agroecology from scaling up?
Yeah, that's a really, really important question and not an easy one to answer. But let me start with something that Naimid said earlier, that agroecology is rooted in diversity. And I think one of the big problems is that most societies are not ready to deal with diversity, neither socially nor biophysically with the food. So we don't have now we don't know anymore how to cook these things. We don't know where we get them, how to produce them. So there's a huge problem with diversity also regarding seeds, for example. So dietary diversity and so on. So this is one point, but we have to think broader here. And there I want to come a bit from my work where I do research, which is the lock-ins that I mentioned earlier also that impede this kind of transformation that we want towards agroecology and sustainability. And this has been analyzed by many scientists already and summarized in many publications. So often at the center of this analysis is the massive power concentration in the system. So there's so much power with very few corporations that decide almost everything in the food system, be it seeds, be it fertilizers, be it the distribution of the food, or be it the transformation of the food and so on. Those are very few actors, and they create narratives together with their political allies that they are feeding the world, or there are certain political expectations around that food has to be cheap, even though it's just empty calories, that doesn't matter. So what the values are around food is very much shaped by these kind of power conglomerations. And then also it's very common in science, for example, that we think about food in silos. We only think about production and agriculture, or we only think about calories and nutrition. I mean, there are of course many other approaches, but there's still a little bit of a domination of certain silo approaches in the food system that stand in the way of working together and coming to more holistic approaches. And then also the strong belief that technology solves everything, that impedes us to see the justice issues, or also the fact that there's already a lot more food produced that's actually needed to feed everyone. It's just not getting there and not used for food, right? So these kind of things stand in the way of agroecological transformation, and they are all linked to the concentration of power and the related interests. And it's also very important to understand that this has nothing to do with solving hunger, right? So this is really related to certain past dependencies that have been growing over a long time, and they prevent every other approach from scaling, including agroecology.
Wow. Yeah, that's very interesting. Naimid, do you think that agroecology is more expensive for farmers or consumers, or is this a misconception?
I think it's actually a misconception. I mean, the real challenge, of course, is maybe often during the transition period. Like we said before, that farmers may face maybe yield fluctuations, learning cost, uncertainty, and a lot of on-farm work. But this is why I believe that public policies, technical support, and also fair markets are very important to accompany the farmers during this phase. But in my country, I can see that we have several very large and medium scale farms that before were conventional, and nowadays and they are agroecological. So, and one of the most famous, for example, is La Aurora, is called, and they have 650 hectares in Buenos Aires, and they are producing grains, livestock without agrochemicals for more than, I think, 25 years. And the yields of them are comparable to conventional system, and the costs are much, much lower. So I think it's actually a misconception that it shouldn't be more expensive, actually.
All right, let's end on a high note and talk about the future. Johanna, what excites you the most about the future of agroecology?
Agroecology for me is a very hopeful thing in these times of rather despair, I would say. Seeing that it absolutely works ecologically, it provides kind of a perspective of possibility of humans to interact with the other parts of nature, because we're also, of course, part of nature, but human and non-human nature together in a convivial, so to say, relationship, and not necessarily in a destructive relationship. So it shows us, agroecology can really show us that it's actually really possible that we as humans can play a positive role in nature. And I think that's a very exciting view. We know that it works, and we have to do everything to get there. I mean, this is also a beautiful task, challenging, but important and great.
And Naimid, on hearing that, so what about you? What gives you hope for the future of agroecology?
What gives me the most hope for me is the people behind the farms, the farmers themselves. I think everywhere I go, in different regions and cultures, I met different farmers. When they are really deeply committed to caring for their lands, their communities, and the future generations, despite economic pressures, I think those are, for me, are the hopes.
Yeah, no, that's definitely, our farmers are like a very important part of the changing in the system. So thank you both. There's clearly a lot to be excited about when it comes to the future of agroecology. And I'm really glad to hear that there are positive, still positive aspects about it. Okay, so let's switch gears for a moment. And I want to do a single quick fire question. So no overthinking, and then just the first thing that comes to your mind. And the question is, what is one agroecological practice that every person should try in their back garden? Joanna, you first.
Not a quick answer because it's all interrelated, right? I mean, there's the basic rule that your soil should be always covered. But for that, you need living plants and you need some dead organic material that you can use, for example, leaves. But that for that, again, you need to have a combination of perennial and annual plants, for example. And then ideally, you can use all the different strata. You can do 3D. You can involve trees and shrubs and even climbing plants and build a small food forest, right? So it's incredible what is edible from such food forest. There are edible flowers or there's tree salads, and depending on the climate, you can have that like almost the whole year round. I mean, I harvested the last raspberries in late November, and now the first edible herbs are coming up. So it's really amazing what you can do.
Wow, that's fantastic. So you do gardening in your home?
Yes, of course.
Oh, that's great.
We have a big community garden where I live.
Oh, wow. Oh, great. And Naimid, what about you?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I'm not gonna say also like any like ecological practice that you can find easily in internet, but I wanna suggest a technique. I mean, an activity actually I did with my nephew when I came back to Argentina. He was quite bored, and then he told me, "Okay, I'm bored. I want to do something." And then I created with him a house for insects to welcome insects. He was really happy, and I think it was a very nice activity to share with children. And yeah, so I think yeah, I'm gonna say that to do more activities in the farm, invite people to be connected with nature. This is a nice activity to do and to incorporate the concept of agroecology.
Yeah, that's great. And like involving kids, like the next generation, is also very important to have them like be very mindful on how these things work. So, all right, everyone, that was it for today. It was a lot of fun and it was a very super informative session. Thank you so much to Johanna Jacobi and Naimid Esnarriaga for sharing all your experiences with us in our very first podcast. Thank you so much for joining us today. We learned that agroecology is not just a farming method, it's a way of thinking about food systems that connects nature, people, and resilience. If this episode sparked your curiosity, make sure to subscribe to our bi-monthly podcast series. In our next episode, we will explore another everyday topic in agroecology that's far more interesting than it appears. I'm your host, Evelyn Zuniga, and this has been Agroecology Bites.